Hello, everyone. My name is Molly Sachs, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to Equity in Hiring, Building a Diverse Talent Pipeline. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. Close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. We recommend calling in with a phone instead of using your computer speakers. If you experience visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn one continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. Please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We'll hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters today, Colleen Rogers, Joey Schreiber, and Rob Henry.
Thank you, Molly. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Colleen Rogers. I'm a senior consultant with the executive search team at Campbell & Company. I've been with Campbell & Company for 12 years now, always a part of the executive search team, and have really had the pleasure of working with just about the entire spectrum of nonprofit organizations across the country, everything from tiny historical sites to really large academic medical centers and everything in between. So I'm happy to be here and presenting this webinar with my colleagues.
Thanks, Colleen. My name is Joey, and I've been with the executive search team at Campbell & Company for just over 5 years. And like Colleen, I've worked to recruit leaders for organizations as small as, storefront food pantries and as large as, universities, from Anchorage, Alaska to, Washington, D.C. So have really enjoyed my time in the sector and getting to meet a lot of really amazing, interesting people. I have a certification in from AIRS in diversity recruiting, so this is a topic of particular interest for me today.
Thanks, Joey. I'm Rob Henry, the Vice President of Education at CASE. I've been with CASE now 15 years, 5 years as the Vice President. As many of you know, this has been a space that I've been committed to for years. I've probably been in this space for over 20 years and really excited about the work that CASE has done, whether it's the internship program, the residency program, and many other programs that we've done to really advance this topic for the profession.
So we're going to start. Go ahead, Colleen.
Go ahead, Joey. Sorry, just to give a quick overview of what we're looking to cover in this webinar, we're going to start out by sharing some of the data around equity within nonprofit organizations with you, then move on to some of the common challenges and concerns that we hear in recruiting, and particularly in work to recruit diverse candidates. And from there, we'll move on to what some of the strategies and best practices are in how to do this work. And then we'll wrap things up with some questions and discussion at the end. And with that, I'll kick it over to Joey to get us started in taking a look at some of the data.
Yeah, we wanted to start with data. I mean, it's always best practice to kind of ground your decision-making in data. And also when you're having conversations about the topic that we're focusing on today, those can be challenging ones. It can be helpful sometimes to ground this kind of topic, any kind of topic, but especially ones that are challenging like this in a more objective base point, like the data that we're about to go through. So to start, there is something that a lot of you on the call today have probably heard of before, which is status quo bias. This comes from the Harvard Business Review, studies that showing that when there's only one woman or minority candidate in a pool of 4 finalists, their odds of being hired are non-existent. So that's something that I think we've seen from executive search, where organizations really want to have like at least one candidate in their pool that represents a particular demographic. And even though the studies show that that's maybe not the best way to approach it, if there's only one person, it doesn't usually work out in the way that you might think it would. So when the candidate pool is more balanced, if there's 4 people and there are 2 candidates who are female or 2 candidates who are minorities, then the likelihood of there being hiring increases to 50%. So that's something good to be aware of. And then the Center for Effective Philanthropy analyzed demographic data from 2009 to 2019. So that's pretty, over 10 years. And, the data, it comes out as I think a lot of us would expect. 75% of the respondents who are executive directors were white, 9% were African American or Black, 6% identified as Hispanic or Latinx, 4% identified as Asian, including the Indian subcontinent, 3% identified as multiracial, 1% identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native, 4% identified as Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian, and 1% identified as a race or ethnicity not listed above. 60% of these respondents, these who are executive directors of nonprofits, identify as female. Now, something we wanted to look at was breaking this down by budget, because for a couple of reasons. And if you look at this graph, you can see the first category is organizations with budgets below 500,000, all the way up to the fourth chart there, which is organizations with budgets above 8.5 million. And I think that, like, right away, what you see is that executive directors of color are vastly outnumbered by executive directors who are white, no matter the size of the organization. That being said, there is this assumption that the nonprofit sector does a better job than the corporate sector in terms of having, leadership, gender, diversity and gender leadership. So like, CEOs who are women. I think that people tend to think the nonprofit sector is doing a little bit better in that department. And the interesting thing is that when you really start to break down the organizations by budget, you start to see that, it is true that like female executive directors are the biggest slice of the pie. White female executive directors are the biggest slice of the pie for organizations until they are on the biggest end of the budget size. So organizations above 8.5 million, suddenly the largest slice of the pie actually becomes executive directors who are white males. And that's important because the larger the organization's budget, the larger the executive director's salary, and the larger the impact that organization and that leader is able to have. So what you wind up having is executive directors, the ones who are the highest paid and with the most influence, are still white men, even in the nonprofit sector. And we also, this kind of furthers a lot of those points that I just covered on the last slide. For someone with the same job and qualifications, this is from a study by payscale.com, Black women earn 97 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned by a white man, and Black men earn 98 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned by a white man. And so, that may seem, a small difference, but over time, those dollars really add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars that are lost due to someone's identity, racial identity. And also, I think I want to point out that that's just for someone with the same job and same qualifications on paper. So I think that's important because if you're, someone who is marginalized, reaching the same level of qualifications as someone who doesn't face those same barriers takes a lot more work. So we're talking about people who are just on the same, playing field on paper, and that's not even taking into account all of the, extra, things that it takes to kind of, get to that point. And then if you look at the top 100 largest charities, so the top 100 largest charities in the United States, 65 of them are led by white men. So that's an even larger percentage than when you break down the charities just above 8.5 million. Now the graph at the bottom here shows. This is also from the pay scale study. It was done between 2018 and 2020 and had 500,000 respondents. And they were from folks not just in the nonprofit sector. It was both the for-profit and nonprofit sector. And what this graph shows is the percentage of individuals who are individual contributors. And by that, those are folks who have titles that could be assistant or specialist or coordinator, essentially people who don't manage other people. You can see, that the breakdown in terms of demographics there. Now, as you move up to people who are in management roles, so where they, have at least one direct report, the numbers start to change. And then when you move into people who are in director roles, so people who manage staff that then manage other staff, the numbers start shifting. And by the time you reach the most senior level position, an executive position, we kind of see where things pan out, which is consistent with everything that we've been seeing already from the rest of these studies. And so just to wrap up this section, two points. Fund the People's 2019 Talent Justice Report found that executive directors of color are more likely than their white counterparts to have foundations take a wait and see approach to providing funding. And then the Building Movement Project's research on nonprofit executives shows that nonprofits led by executive directors of color tend to have smaller budgets and rely more heavily on foundation funding than those led by white executive directors. And that's important because what this means is that the leaders who depend on foundation funding the most have to work the hardest to get it.
So I think I'm going to pick it up here, right, Joy? This is looking at the common challenges and concerns. I do want to say I think it's really important, and you'll notice in this presentation that we have a lot of data. And I think that's critical because as we do the D&I work, and for CASE, we're really looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It's really important that you understand the data of your organization to really start to set your strategy. So if we go to the next slide, what you'll see here, thank you, Joy. We again kind of highlighted what we think are 4 of these kind of key issues that we're dealing with, right? One, we know this, our leadership doesn't look like the people that we're serving. And so the question is, how do we do that? We know looking at demographics, the numbers are drastically changing. We often say we're not a minority anymore. I'm still struggling with some programs that I've created for CASE that are titled minority, right? Because we are the majority dealing still with some of these issues. Our search committee doesn't represent the diversity of the organization or the communities that we serve. And I think this is a place where we have to be more intentional. I always ask the question is, what is it that I influence? What is it that I change? And where is it that I can't do either? And in the search committee, that's a place that you actually have control. And then one of the things that I do with search committees is I say to them, my goal is not to have you select the person I'm going to have as the final candidate. What I want you to do is, out of these 5 people, I want you to tell me who can do the job. And then based on our needs, we will pick the candidate from there. Because what happens, and we all know this, we pick people who look like us. And so that's why I think we have to just change our orientation in terms of thinking about search committees. The junior staff is diverse and the senior staff is not. I think this is why it's so critical to think about what are your pipeline programs, because that's where the diversity is often sitting in your organization. One of the things I think we also have to ask ourselves, how do we create more visibility for diverse staff members in the organization? And what I mean by that is, are the white people in your organization the ones leading key initiatives? Because if they are, they're the ones getting visibility from your volunteers and from your senior leadership. So when an opportunity comes, guess what? We're going to go to the people that we know. So that's why I'm thinking in terms of that. And then the last one we have here, I think I see your screen here. Thank you, Joy. We need diverse candidates, or do we need a diverse pool? I have been pushing this one, and I think Joy had a great slide earlier, especially from the Harvard Business Review, right? That says there's just this assumption that if I have a diverse pool, I have a chance of getting a diverse candidate. And it's just not true. And so part of the challenge I ask is, do you want a diverse pool or do you want a diverse candidate? And do you know the difference? And often I don't think we do. So again, if you really are saying I must have a diverse candidate, and then you don't get that from this pool, I argue you continue the search. But again, that's the place that you'll have to challenge yourself. We'll go to the next slide, please. We don't want to compromise our qualifications. As a Black man, I've heard this one over and over again, right? So whenever you create a minority-related program, the first comment you will hear is, we got to make sure they're qualified. But I argue if we created that same program that was focused on white men, that would not come out of anyone's mouth. Those, just so we know, as we talk about some of these D&I terms, it's really microaggressions, right? It's the person in an interview that says, wow, Rob is really articulate. But what you're really saying is you assume that Black people are not. And now this person becomes the exception. The next slide you'll see is going to show you in terms of the qualifications that we have of people. And again, this is from BoardSource. 31% of people of color have a bachelor's degree versus 33% of white respondents. I see this happening in organizations all the time, where a person of a diverse background will either get passed, will get moved, or move to a different area, and the person who's under them will get promoted, and they have less credentials than the person in the role does. Again, how do we just ask ourselves, does that make sense, and are we really being fair? 49% of people of color have a master's degree in comparison to 53%. And 9% of individuals that are people of color have a PhD or a law degree, whereas 8% white. And so someone asked me, well, why is that? That's the first time you've seen a flip in those numbers. Because often many of us as people of color think we need additional degrees to be competitive with our counterparts. So that's just some of the information I wanted to share. And I think I have one more. Nope, now I'm going to turn it over to Colleen.
Thank you both, Rob and Joey. I appreciate it. So we've shared all this data. We've heard what kind of the common concerns are. So what do we do to try and address all of this in our organizations or those that we're working with? I think really you start with the basics. And first and foremost in that is that you have to recognize that this is going to take time. There's no magic potion that's going to solve these issues for you next week or maybe even next month. But as Rob alluded to, you also really need to start by defining what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean for your organization. Look at what you're missing. For some organizations, it might be as simple as needing more men on staff if you're predominantly female, or maybe you have a lot of African American staff, but there's nobody from the Latinx community. So look at where those missing pieces are and then begin to address how you can maybe fix those gaps. Really give some thought to what makes your organization appealing to diverse candidates and people of color. And are there things that you can fix to make it more appealing? I also want to just say there's no shame in tackling the easy things first. Absolutely great for building momentum and getting buy-in and getting some early wins so that people aren't discouraged in this work, because it is work. Another big one, and we're definitely advocates of this within Campbell and Company and the recruiting that we do, certainly on behalf of our clients, is transparency and compensation. Personally, whether we're talking about building a diverse pipeline or just any pipeline of candidates, I think this is a good idea. The more clarity and openness we can have around compensation, the better. Nobody wants to waste their time. Recruiter, a candidate, either one. If somebody needs to be making $200,000 a year, you don't want to waste their time or yours if you can really only pay $125,000. So I think just really being transparent around that is really critically important. We're also really in the last several years seeing a lot more legislation in terms of banning the use of salary history in determining compensation when making hiring decisions. And really this goes back to addressing what Joey was talking about earlier in terms of the wage gap between men and women, as well as white and non-white staff. Pay what the job is worth in your organization. Don't determine that based on what somebody may have made in a previous role that may have been overpaid or underpaid for any number of reasons that could exist for that happening. Figure out what you can afford and what this position is worth and set that as the salary range for this role and go based on that. I think it's also really important to look at transferable skills. And I know this is an area that Rob has done a lot of work in as well. But what are other areas of expertise that people could bring into a role that might fit? You know, for example, if we're looking at a fundraising position, people with a background in marketing or sales often can make that transition pretty well just because of the relationship building nature of that work. So try to identify where those opportunities are and build that in to your recruiting process. And also to touch on something Rob has already mentioned, make sure that you're looking at a diverse search committee and beyond that, a diverse interview team. You know, if you don't have that representation in your organization already, consider how else you might be able to bring that into the process. You know, that might mean engaging volunteers as a part of the search committee or interview team, or, you know, other community participants who have been really engaged with the programs that you offer and can bring a helpful perspective as well as bringing some of more representation to your committee or interview team. So moving on from there, job description. Obviously, it's sort of the core of everything to do with recruiting. It's where everything starts. It's what almost everything refers back to. So be really mindful as you're creating a job description. Make sure that you're using inclusive language. You know, be careful about pronouns that you're using in there, and take advantage of the tools that exist in terms, you know, a couple that we've mentioned here are Textio or Gender Decoder. When we first started using these, it was surprising to me, frankly, some of the terminology that did have some inherent bias in it. And I think we can all learn from that on an ongoing basis. And it can just help, leveraging some of those tools can help just build awareness and mindfulness about that. Again, make sure you're using specific language when it comes to talking about salary and benefits. Include it in the job description or a salary range if it's not a specific salary number. Benefits, I would say, you know, you don't have to get into every nitty-gritty thing, but cover the big pieces, you know, and if your organization is small and isn't able to offer, you know, employer-funded healthcare, but maybe you do have a stipend that you offer to help offset staff having to purchase that on their own, make sure you mention things like that. It might be a deal breaker for some candidates, but for others it may not be. And I think the more clarity you can build around that, the better off you'll be. You know, be clear about expectations for the role. You know, this is a big one. One of the most common reasons I think I hear for why people leave a job is that, you know, they felt the expectations weren't either clear or realistic. And I think one of the things we've done at Campbell and Company in our recruiting in a way to address this is we have its own separate section in the job descriptions we create that outline the 3 or 4 really critical accomplishments that somebody will need to achieve within their first 2 years coming into a role. And we've really gotten some good feedback that it's helpful for candidates to understand the strategic priorities for an organization and a specific position. I also want to say, don't overinflate the need for a particular degree or certification. Give some real thought to what the must-haves are versus the nice-to-haves. If you're recruiting for a marketing leader, do they really need to have an MBA, or is it more important that they bring really senior level strategic experience? If it's a finance role, do they have to have a CPA certification, or is there equivalent of experience that will cover that for you? For fundraisers, do you really need a CFRE, or do you want an equivalent amount of experience and commitment to the sector and profession? So really give thought to those pieces. And if it really is a nice to have, make sure that it's written in a way that makes that point clear. And again, make sure that transferable skills and experience are written into the job description so that you're not being exclusionary in writing these things. It can be as simple as, if you're recruiting for a fundraiser, changing 7 years of senior fundraising experience to 7 years of senior fundraising, marketing, or sales experience, just to make sure you're making it clear that there is an openness to those other backgrounds and experiences.
Colleen, can I just add a comment to this?
Yeah.
One of the things that I see organizations now doing in job descriptions is saying organization X works with many diverse members and volunteers. And we're looking for someone who knows how to work with diverse constituencies. Again, as another signal that we are open and looking for diverse candidates as well, just as a strategy.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a very good point. Thank you, Rob. So then, you've got the job description, you've posted ads, you're starting to reach out to people, people are applying. Now you have to start making decisions about who you want to talk to and interview, and then hiring decisions from there. I think it's really important to look beyond the prestige organizations and really assess accomplishments and how that relates to the needs for the role and the organization at this point in time. Harvard is always going to look great on somebody's resume. There's no getting around that. But if you're a smaller organization and you need somebody who's going to be scrappy and be able to thrive in an environment that doesn't have the resources of Harvard, that person may not be the best fit. They may be great, they may be qualified, but they might not be the right person for your organization or this job. So I think you really need to look beyond that. And I would say that extends not just to job history, but also to where people have earned their degrees. The person who graduated from Harvard, but maybe they were barely graduated, might not be the best candidate, but the person who went to a state school and was valedictorian and president of their class might be even more accomplished. You have to get past what that looks like on paper. So this next point, I think, seems really obvious, but isn't always. Make sure that when you're crafting interview questions, that they all refer back to the job description. Really use that as your guide throughout the process. And then make sure that you're asking the same questions of every candidate that you interview. You could absolutely ask follow-up questions, questions that are specific to certain candidates based on what their specific experience is, but make sure that the core of the interview and what you're asking people is really consistent across everyone. And it's going to lead us to the next point about using scorecards. Create, essentially a scorecard to assess candidates sort of by the content areas and what the big overarching pieces of that job description are. It can really help you determine what those critical factors are and where some candidates might be stronger than others. Perhaps if this is a chief role, staff management might be key, as well as the ability to work with the board of directors. Some candidates might be stronger in the staff management piece and others might be stronger on the board level. What is going to be the really deciding factor for you, and how does that balance lie and play out across your candidate pool? It can really help kind of take things to a more apples to apples assessment in a lot of ways. And then particularly if you're using panel interviews or have a number of people who are interviewing candidates, I think it's really important to request that they provide feedback to the hiring manager or whoever the decision maker is in an individualized, private, preferably written way before there's any sort of debrief as a group. It really can help avoid the persuasion and groupthink that can come out of those conversations with a number of people, and avoid some of the decision making based on whoever happens to be the loudest voice in the room, and really incorporate perspectives from a number of people across the spectrum of whoever we're interviewing candidates.
Yeah, Colleen, I just wanted to say that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
That's a really important one, because when you have a candidate meet with a group of people, the candidate leaves the room, the first person in that, and who's left in the room, the first person who speaks up and says, gosh, I thought that person was amazing, or I'm not sure about how he did. That really informs how then everyone else who's in the room, weighs in. Because if you're if you're on a panel and with a vice president who starts off by saying that they didn't like candidate X, you may have really liked candidate X, and you're then a lot less inclined to vouch for them because of just the social pressure in the room. So all of these things are important because they help to keep you accountable, hold you on track. I mean, it's bias, unconscious bias is what leads to a lot of these issues. And I think that that last point about the feedback is just a really critical one.
So my question to you,
absolutely.
What do we do then to make sure that doesn't happen?
It's hard. It is. And we've struggled with this, and it's hard in working with clients because there's inevitably that 5 minutes at the end of an interview where people are still gathered and you just are wanting to share that. For better or for worse, that might be one of the things that's improved with pandemic life and everything being done by video. Is it's done, everybody clicks leave meeting, so there isn't as much of that. A lot of this, I think, comes back to being very mindful and, to use the word you mentioned earlier, Rob, being really intentional about this work.
Yeah, and what I would recommend, and I love, again, this piece you have, Colleen, about the scorecard, is that when the candidate leaves, the first thing we all have to do is go to our scorecard, right? So that takes out some of the noise, but then allows us to focus on an activity, and for Rob to put his scores and Joey to put his scores. And then after that, if we want to have a discussion, we can have the discussion. But again, just trying to add some strategy as we kind of talk about some of these decisions.
Rob, I've been in debriefs where we've done exactly this. We've used the scorecards, and we've had everyone provide their feedback on the scorecard separately before they got together as a group. And it worked out really well, because then when they did get together as a group, all of the information, all the feedback that people had was just right there up on the screen already. I mean, there wasn't any, oh, well, I'm going to change my answer because so-and-so, said that. I mean, it was just there. Everyone kind of saw what everybody else said before having been, influenced by each other. And that was because the very minute that person walked out of the room, everyone, there was no time, there was no opportunity for anyone to talk to each other. It was, go do your feedback now.
You got it.
If we want to move into the next slide, pay attention to your pipeline and how you're building that out, because recruiting does not just happen when you are looking to fill a specific role. And I think we've all been in the situation of meeting the absolutely perfect person at not the right time. When that happens, keep in touch, keep their information on hand, connect on LinkedIn, create a file, whether that's, a spot in your drawer with business cards, or it's an electronic file in some ways. Flag them in your database in some way you're going to remember and be able to go back and find later, just to be able to keep touch, so that It's not all having to just stay in your head. And when the right time comes, you can go back to that right person. Make it a point at networking events, whether it's virtual or in person again someday. Make it a point to talk with somebody who doesn't look like you. Push yourself to step out of your comfort zone. Do as I say, not as I do. I'm the worst offender at this particular point, but it really can go a long way to really push yourself to do this. Get to know what the affinity groups are that are out there. I know CASE has a lot, AFP has them, groups within their membership that are of African American, Latinx, LGBTQ. Get to know where those organizations exist and start building a network with them and participating with them so that you can reach out and have those relationships when it comes time to recruit someone for your organization, that you can reach out and, engage them to help make referrals. Really, these last 2 points, I think, just go so hand in hand. Embed recruiting and networking and diversity into your business practice as an organization. And remember that this is not just the work of HR or the recruiters that you have on staff or that you hire to work with your organization. It's up to everybody, the interview team, managers, leadership, anybody who is working for your organization, representing it in the community, to go out and build those networks and keep track of people and make referrals. It's a great way to bring talent into your organization. The one caveat to this will be, back to the point Rob made earlier, we all tend to gravitate towards people who look like ourselves. So try to be mindful to not only refer people who look like you or come from a similar background to you, or to only refer the same person over and over again for everything. And really, if everybody's doing a little bit of this, it can multiply in a really huge way across your organization, which just gets everybody that much further down the path. The one add-on to this that's not a point, but it also is a nice segue to the retention slide we're going to get to in just a minute, especially coming out of the pandemic. Think about, when you're hiring, if the role could be done remotely or work from home on a more permanent basis. I think we've all shown that there is a lot more success in doing this than people may have thought. So really give some thought as to whether that could be a permanent situation for any role you're hiring for, or even a hybrid of more remote and in office when we all return to doing that again. I just really believe that the flexibility on that point creates a much broader pool of candidates, a much more diverse pool of candidates, and it's going to be nothing but benefit to an organization unless it's really a critical role that has to be done in office. So we've recruited people. They've agreed to come work with us. You have to remember that DEIA work does not end the moment a person of color shows up for their first day of work with your organization. This is a journey. It needs to be embedded. Equity and inclusion and belonging need to just be a part of the culture of your organization to really do this successfully. I would say that this slide really is the other big reason we hear why people leave organizations and leave jobs, is that they didn't see the opportunity for growth and professional development where they were, so they've chosen to move on. So particularly for managers and those that are leading staff, make sure that everybody on your team is aware of and able to access and take advantage of professional development opportunities. I think some people are really great at identifying this for themselves and just driving that forward. Other people aren't. And especially, I think, if we're going back to people with those more transferable skills or coming from other areas of expertise, somebody coming from a marketing background into a fundraising role may not know that CASE or AFP exist. So help them build that awareness and an awareness of what might be out there for them to take advantage of and be able to grow their own skill set in their careers. But also balance that by looking at what the opportunities are within your organization. If somebody expresses an interest in learning something new and there are opportunities to do that within your organization, find pathways to make that happen. It can be something as simple as a staff member is on vacation or on medical leave, somebody needs to step in and cover certain aspects of their role. Use that to help build and guide the growth of your staff internally. And I'm actually going to bump the succession planning point up here because I think it's really critical. Succession planning is not about wanting somebody to leave when it's at its best. I really believe it's about taking a holistic look at your organization and planning for the future, and really takes into account what those professional development and growth opportunities are and builds that into your talent development in-house. It's a great way to grow people from within, and especially in those organizations that are more diverse and have more representative diversity at junior or mid levels, but not as much as at the senior and leadership team. It's a great way to build that experience so that can change over time. It's a long game, but it can get you there. And then finally, when people do leave your organization or are promoted, really take a look at who that is and what the reasons are, and if any trends are emerging from that. And if there are trends, work to find ways to address those so that you can, go back to defining what the diversity, equity, and inclusion mean for your organization and how you can address that to be better going forward. And with that, I think we can move into any questions or discussion.
Great, thanks, Colleen. We do have some questions on deck, so I will just jump right in. At my org, we have the problem of having an extremely diverse junior staff, but we aren't at all diverse on the senior level. We don't have a lot of turnover on the senior level. How can we still be intentional about diversifying our senior staff in this case? Is it more or less focusing on the pipeline, as Colleen mentioned, or is there more we can do?
I think that's challenging because if there aren't opportunities, if people aren't leaving, it becomes, the rare occasion that somebody might, or if there's enough growth in the organization that you're creating new senior leadership positions, and then being mindful to recruit diverse candidates into those if that happens. But otherwise, I do think it's kind of about building the pipeline and developing within just to help move people up so they are getting closer to that level. Nobody stays forever.
Well, and you also don't, if you can't see yourself represented in a position that you're striving toward, you probably won't be striving towards a position unless you can see yourself represented in it. So that is a real issue. It's not just about building the pipeline at the bottom. It's about thinking about how you are building your leadership team at the top, and it could be re-examining what the organizational infrastructure of executive decision making looks like. I mean, that's a common problem. There's not an easy answer to it.
Yeah, and I would say to the question, the trend that you're seeing at your organization is very consistent with most organizations. And so I think there's a responsibility, depending, again, part of it is to the profession. What are we doing? Are we building mentoring programs? So now your senior leadership that is predominantly white now is intentionally interacting with your staff members of color, because that interaction starts to create a different perception of the issues and the challenges of people of diverse backgrounds. So I think that's one of the things that we have to do. And then the second one is knowing that I might be spending this time working with Rob Henry and giving him additional experiences, and I may lose him. But at the end, we've really helped the organization, or the profession, if you will, advance. And then in time, based on the experiences he or she may have, we then might be able to recruit that person back to the organization at a higher role. But again, it's really thinking and being intentional in terms of your strategy.
I think the other piece that's, particularly in nonprofit organizations, you've got a board of directors too. And hopefully, if we're following best practices and governance, there are term limits. So there's going to be turnover there that's consistent, anticipated. You can predict when it's going to happen. So, you can help address some of that, I think, to some degree, if your senior staff is really consistent. make sure you're really building out diversity at your board level so that there is that leadership. And, to the point Joey made, you're seeing yourself represented in leadership for the organization in that way, even if it's not necessarily happening at senior staff because of a lack of turnover.
I think, Rob, you made a really good point when you said it's important to be willing to spend time with someone more junior and mentor them, but be comfortable with the fact that they may leave. Because if your approach is to build a pipeline of more junior staff that are going to grow into leadership positions, you can't have a culture where there's this intense pressure for someone who's at a more junior level to stay there their whole career, because that's not equitable, that's not inclusive either. So you really do have to I just think that's an important point of knowing that, you may spend a lot of time with cultivating someone and they may leave the organization, and that's okay.
Thank you. For our next question, can you speak to how these best practices might apply to evaluation tools and hiring beyond just the interview? They're specifically interested in reference checks.
Good question. Again, I would advocate in terms of best practice being to ask the same reference questions for everyone. Create a list for yourself, refer back to it. Absolutely, you can have things that are specific to each candidate, but you want to cover what the key pieces are and be consistent in those conversations. So, if you're talking to 3 references for the white candidate, only talk to 3 candidates for the Black or Latinx candidate. Don't create any special hoops to jump through or extra steps for candidates of color. We've seen that happen too because of a perceived differential in qualifications or whatever it may be. So just really be mindful to be consistent in your process at whatever level it is in that hiring decision making.
I think it's worth including a question when you're speaking with references. I think it's worth including a question where you ask the reference, how have you seen this candidate, demonstrate, inclusive behavior, or something along those lines.
And I think the big issue you're often dealing with is just unconscious bias. I mean, let's be honest. In a reference, what I'm trying to do is kind of get under those things we weren't certain about during that interview process. And my fear sometimes with that is there's a concern or my own issue that I have that really is my personal issue, but now because this person is a person of diverse backgrounds, I might make that assumption. Well, they really write well, even though they presented these documents. And so then when you're in that reference check, you're asking those questions that are based off of unconscious bias. That's the part I would just encourage you. So I think, Colleen, you're exactly right. Those questions also need to be the same, just to make sure you're being consistent.
Can someone ask for feedback on their application after being rejected at the application stage?
Yes. I think that's best practice in general to do, and I try to, provide as much as I can when, people have come to me with that question. If there's, a job that has, like say you're applying for something on LinkedIn and it shows you're one of, 200 other candidates, and you aren't chosen to move forward to a phone interview, you may not get, a lot of feedback because of, the fact that you're at that early stage. But if you've talked to a recruiter, if you've had any kind of conversation with the hiring manager, I think that it's always worth making space for that.
Can you provide more best practices for retention of diverse talent? My organization says they want to retain diverse talent, but they don't do a lot to make that a reality.
A good question. I think a lot of it comes down to what the inclusion practices are. Are the diverse staff members treated the same as, you know, white staff, or, you know, junior staff treated the same as more senior team members. And really, I think a lot of it comes down to those professional development opportunities. And if people feel that their voices and experiences are heard and acknowledged and recognized, some of those less tangible things, I think, can go a really long way. You know, and again, try to have those exit interviews when people leave and learn, okay, what are the real reasons? You know, is it just that a really great opportunity came your way that you couldn't pass up and you needed to pursue it because it, you know, seems to perfectly align with your career goals? Or is there some reason that you really were looking to leave the organization, and try to scratch past the surface to get at what some of that might be and find ways to address it?
And the only thing I would add to Colleen's great point is, I think and I'm now just going to talk as people of color, we really have to understand that we're interviewing the company or working through in a search firm, that we really understand the organization that we're going to. You know, I always say, yes, you're interviewing me, but let me be clear, I'm also interviewing you in this process. And we really have to understand what the expectations are, and then what's the support I'm going to get to meet these expectations. I think sometimes I will share with you, I had a headhunter call me, and they were hiring for a VP or a Chief Advancement Officer. And the goal was to raise $1 billion in 2 years. And I asked the question, because I'm committed to, I need to make sure I'm sending you the right person. How much has your program raised in the last year? And she says, well, we got a grant for 100,000. There's just no way anyone can be successful in that setting. So really understand the program that you're going to, because I think that's part of the retention process as well.
Is there a good tool for looking at inherent language bias for anything other than gender?
Good question. I think there are a lot of tools out there. And the gender decoder one that we mentioned, I believe, is free. Textio, I think, gets beyond just gender bias and does look at other biases that come into our language usage. That one, I think you can do a free trial, but if you want to use it more extensively, it is a paid subscription model. I know there are other tools out there, you know, even to some extent, even just, you know, Googling, you know, resources, and you can find lists of terms and kind of what the inherent bias is in them that you may not necessarily have been aware of. Joey, are there any others that you can think of? Those are the ones I know that we've used.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that Textio offers, you know, that kind of functionality, but there's a cost. It's not like a free, you know, you have to pay for it.
And that's the one I was thinking about too, guys.
Yeah.
All right, next question. When positions open up, what should processes look like for hiring? If someone in-house could be good for the role, should they have to go through a process or just be promoted? And should that process be open to external applicants?
I think it can depend on the situation. I mean, I think there's a lot of other background information that comes into play. You know, has this been an intentional path to kind of grow somebody specifically to move into a more senior role, you know, whether that's a chief development officer or CEO position, whatever that might be. You know, I think in those cases where it's been a really planned process within the organization, you can just do that. You know, particularly, I think if it's a long-serving leader that's leaving, it can be helpful, even if you do think you have a strong candidate within your organization, it can be helpful to do a full search process just to
validate.
I mean, it sounds bad, but to kind of reinforce that, or frankly, to determine if that internal person is the right candidate, or if bringing somebody with, outside experience and perspective and all of that, and, potentially more diversity might be the right move.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I wrote down a couple of notes. One is really about just consistency. Are you doing it for some candidates and then for some candidates that you're not? And ironically, is it the people of color that you're making go through the process, and others you're saying, we're just going to promote you. So I say consistency is one of the things. I think the other thing is you just really have to think about whether that's the organization, what's the philosophy, I say salary philosophy, behind that as an organization. Do you value your internal employees? And we've seen this often, right? Internal employees often make less than the external candidate does. But again, what is that philosophy that you're doing? But consistency is one. I think that if we're not careful, will always get us in trouble. And then it's just really about what the philosophy is of the organization.
Right. I think we have time for a couple more questions. How do you measure diversity in candidate pools?
I think one important way to think about this is looking at, if you're measuring, say you're measuring the number of candidates of color in a candidate pool, don't just look at that number for, the final pool of 5 or 6 people. Look at what that number was like from the initial 100 resumes that you got for the role. What did that number then look like once you narrowed that down to, maybe 15 people that you screened by phone? What does that number then look like once you narrowed that pool? If that percentage is shrinking over time, then there's a lesson there. So I think it's important to kind of look at the percentage of diversity in your pool as the search evolves and as the pool narrows.
Great. To close us out, what are 1 or 2 key takeaways that you each want the audience to leave with?
I think it goes back to a lot of what we've already said. And, have you defined what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean for your organization and what that needs to look like for your organization? And, from my standpoint, I'm a big fan of succession planning. I think really embedding that can do a lot of really great things for your organization. What does that look like, and with a specific intentionality around how you're developing diverse employees?
And I can go next. My 2 is we've got to figure out the pool versus actually hiring a diverse candidate. And we've got to understand the difference of that. And are we or our institutions committed to that? I think I've had so many conversations where individuals have said, I was the final 2. I was the final 2. Of course you were, because what the group was looking for was a diverse pool, not for a diverse candidate. So I think that's one of the ones. And then the other one that I'm learning even myself the hard way as I work, even in terms of some of my own decisions, am I giving visibility to the people of color the same way as I'm giving it to people who are not of color in the organization? And then understanding then the impact that has in terms of their careers would be my 2 points.
I would say keep trying and be comfortable with the fact that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to get it wrong, and that's okay as long as you keep trying. Don't get discouraged by the bumps that you're going to hit in the road, because they will happen. The important thing is to get back on the road.
And the only thing I would add to Joey and Colleen, it might be helpful that we share with the group the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, just so they have some samples to also use.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great, thank you all. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and a special thank you to Rob for sharing his time and expertise. Look out for our email with the webinar recording and slides, and please get in touch if you have questions. We also encourage you to sign up for future Campbell & Company webinars. Next up is how to successfully onboard nonprofit team members on April 7th. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.